Hello folks, I'm back and I am here to do a little tutorial on how to paint cast resin bases. I've been working collaboratively with Elric's Hobbies recently, and they have a new line of bases for Conquest Last Argument of Kings by Para-Bellum Wargames, and I wanted to paint a few up for them to use in cases and also give you guys a tutorial in how I got there. So in this particular instance, we are working with some of the slate bases which have come out fairly recently. Now, first up, I just quickly reinforced some of the primer. It was a little patchy, so I used some Pro Acryl Coal Black just to fill in any areas that the primer didn't quite hit. They're recessed areas, so nothing too much to worry about with the priming there. I used a little bit of post attack underneath each base just to hold it in place. Doesn't matter too much with these bases, but with some of the others where you want things to align, it's nice to just have them held whilst you're picking up and handling the bases to paint them up. It also means that, you know, if you do any shading or anything like that, as we will do later on, you can have those align across the bases so that the bases set into the larger base actually fit correctly. So next up, I have taken a little bit of Pro Acryl's Dark Flesh and I'm watered it down probably about 50-50 just to help with the flow more than anything. Getting a good coat on all of the dirt areas here. Now, it's not essential that you choose this particular color. I wanted quite a warm brown for this, as I'll be using colder colors on the models that will go on top. And if you want to see the full finished piece, just keep an eye on my Instagram account and you'll be able to see what the whole thing fully assembled looks like. As you can see off to the right hand side, I've got a couple other bases that I'll be doing, and the finished product will be a complete unit of models. So I'm being pretty slapdash in applying this. It really doesn't matter if it goes over the edges or goes onto some of the slate itself, because we'll be painting over all of that in a second. But I do want to work quite quickly. I want this paint to remain wet for my next step. So don't worry too much about it. It's also a little bit patchy here and there. It's not fully covering some of the raised areas because it is thinned a little with water. And again, as long as it has reasonable coverage, that's not too important. I do touch it up in a few places, but for the most part it'll be fine. Now, having done that little bit, I am taking some Pro Acryl Coal Black, the same thing that I used to touch up the primer, and I've very, very heavily watered this down. And using that heavily watered paint, I'm applying it in a few various spots on the bases, particularly on the dirt where the models will be standing, so that it's kind of acting a bit like a cast shadow, and in a few other areas on the base as well to add visual interest. Next up, we have the dark grey blue from Pro Acryl, and this is going to provide the base for our slate pieces. You'll notice that I'm still working whilst the dark flesh paint is wet. That's absolutely fine. I'm working pretty quick on this, rough and ready. I'm getting the large slate pieces first and then kind of just stippling it onto some of the smaller broken shards of slate where it's kind of clearer. You don't need to be too careful with anything with basing. It's one of the nice things about it. As long as you're putting paint in roughly the right areas, it generally looks pretty good. You just want to kind of give the eye the illusion of that variance and organic transition. Now, got to wait a little bit for this to dry. You can see the color shift a little bit as everything dries out. And we next up have a neutral grey from Pro Acryl. This is getting stippled on, so I start with a reasonable quantity in the brush, not heavily loaded, but not quite as dry brushing, and just stipple it. I start with the larger flat areas where I want more to come off of the brush, and then as the brush dries a little further, I start hitting some of the smaller areas around the little bits of slate, etc. I want to cover over most of that dark grey blue that we had earlier, but still leave the impression of it. And again, have a little bit of texture on that stone. Really helps with the realism. Next, you can see is golden brown, and this is a light dry brush, leaving it pretty patchy. I don't want a fully even coverage across the whole base. Again, variance across the surface is a lot of what gives you realism with basing, and as I do other basing styles across this series of videos, you'll hear me talk about this more and more. But for this, some areas lighter, some areas not so light. But with that golden brown, we're focusing very much on the dirt. We then come back and dry brush over everything again, including the slate with Pro Acryl's Ivory. This is not quite a white. It's obviously a warm off-white color. Closer match to the dark flesh than the cold grays that we used on the slate. But that's fine. By using a single color like this, we're helping to bring everything together and make everything feel a little bit more uniform and consistent. And dust will spread across all surfaces, so that works quite well. Next up, we have our pigment powders, or weathering pigments. I use these on almost every base that I'm painting up to a reasonable standard. Both faded blue and slate grey that I'm using here came from Secret Weapon Miniatures in the past. Elric Hobbies now owns that line of paints and products and is putting these out under their own label, but I have a couple of older pots to use here. Note that I use very little of the faded blue just to give some visual interest. The slate green, however, a little bit more natural in the environment, and I was a little heavier with it. As with any good base, the last step is to do that base rim, painted up a nice flat even color. I come from the school of black is my preferred option for that, and in this particular case I'm just using that Pro Acryl Cold Black again. It works really nicely. It matches with what was underneath after I did that those touch-ups, and it has good coverage and covers pretty much everything in a single coat. So with that, we have our finished slate bases for Conquest. As I said before, do please check out my Instagram account, and you will shortly be seeing the finished units that this base and the ones on the right hand side are being painted up for. And if you see Elric's Hobbies in a convention somewhere in the future, you might well see these models as well. I'll be sending them back to Elric's in a few weeks. So as always, folks, thank you for watching. I appreciate that there's no head to camera in this one, but I wanted to just knock it out quickly, get back in the habit of putting up some regular content, and there'll be more in this series coming up. Please, if you've enjoyed this or you found it helpful, comment, like, subscribe, all of those things. Click the notification bell, all of that good stuff. And that will hopefully help encourage me to carry on with this series. I've got a few more bases from this line coming up, including, I think, one or two that may not actually be on Elric Hobbies website yet at the time that I record this. So might be giving you all a sneak peek as to what is coming up in the product line. Thanks as always, folks, for joining, and looking forward to speaking to you again in the next video.